Dr. McClelland, I'm just going to ask you next about some of the events in late 1984 arising out of learning that a domestically produced batch, PFC-produced batch, had caused the infection with AIDS, with HIV of a number of haemophilia patients. We can pick it up, I think, at SBTS 0002206. This is a memo from you to Dr. Perry, 20th of November 1984, and it just sets out the events leading up to the recall of that particular batch. Paragraph 1 reports that it was the 26th of October 84, Dr. Ludlam telephoned you to let you know that 6 patients had developed antibodies to HTLV3. Do you have any recollection now, Dr. McClelland, of learning that information for the first time?
I certainly remember, quite a lot of the events of that week. It was a late evening call from Dr. Ludlam at home. I don't actually remember the phone call, but I certainly remember various things that happened during that week. Yes.
And then, if we look at the rest of the letter, if we keep the whole text on screen, please, of the memo, please. So we can see it would appear next morning you spoke to Dr. Cash. The two of you agreed that there wouldn't yet be a recall of PFC products. You're then off sick, and there are discussions with Dr. Bolton that are recorded here, and which we can ask Dr. Bolton about. But still no decision to recall any batch. And then it would appear it's the following Friday, the 2nd of November 1984, where you receive another late night phone call from Dr. Ludlam, now with confirmation from Dr. Tedder relating to 16 patients, most of whom had received one particular batch. And then paragraph 5 describes on the 3rd of November, you and Dr. Bolton taking action to recall that particular batch. Are you able to add anything to the decision-making process in relation to recall?
Not really. I've obviously thought about it quite a lot because we were questioned quite extensively about the decision to not recall during the Penrose inquiry, and I have talked to various people, not witnesses in the inquiry, but other people who are familiar with the sort of, the practice in the pharmaceutical industry about recall at this sort of time. One of the reasons that we were reluctant to recall this batch was initially was that the information we had at the time indicated that there might actually be, although this batch was clearly heavily suspect, all these patients had received other batches, and the total number I did recorded at the time, but there were I think 9 other batches which had been used, which these patients had received, and we felt that if we recalled that the offending batch, actually the logic was we'd probably have to recall all of the material, and this would have basically left a huge gap in the supply availability for the haemophilia patients. Whether that was a correct judgment or not, I don't know. And I would accept that one can certainly question the decision not to recall earlier. But certainly at the beginning, the positive results were obtained on the initial patients that came from the laboratory of Dr. Richard Tedder, who was working with a very a sort of very much a pre-production assay using isolates, which I think came from the lab of Professor Robin Weiss. And I know Dr. Ludlam was very concerned that these results should be validated because I think he was very reluctant at that point to accept that these patients actually had been infected with HIV, and this may well have coloured the judgment of the event. Obviously, once we knew that there was a substantial number of patients had been infected, there was absolutely no question that we had to recall the batch. As it emerged, there was very little of that batch to recall, apart from a few units that were still in the Aberdeen Transfusion Centre. All the rest of it had been transfused sometime previously.
Now, you undertook some work to identify the infected batch. I'm not going to ask you to look at that. You wrote about it to Dr. Cash on the 15th of November. I'm just going to read out the reference for the benefit of the transcript. LOTH 605_052. But I did want to ask you about what was done to try and ascertain how this had come about, and the efforts to trace the donor, or work out how you had ended up with an infected donation. Can you outline what steps were taken?
As far as two separate questions there, as far as how it came about, all the donations whose plasma contributed to this batch had been collected before any testing was available. So there's, we were doing all our work on donor selection on the basis that there probably were people in the community who were at risk of donation, a small number of whom would have infective blood. So, there's no mystery about how it happened. There were a large number, I can't remember the exact number of donors in this pool, but it would have been in the region of probably about 1,000 donors. It really, there's been no particular surprise that it proved that there was an infective donation among that quite large number. It was a surprise, and it to me and to all of us, it was a surprise, because we really still believed that our blood was safe, and it was a terrible shock to discover that it wasn't. So that's the answer to your first question. It's not a mystery. It was a risk that was totally predictable that this would happen. We just hoped it wouldn't. But we'd done as we discussed before the break, we tried very hard to do what we could in the absence of a test to minimize the risk. Your second question is what was done to trace the donor not to trace the donor, but to identify if one or more donors who had contributed to this batch had evidence of HIV infection. During this period, either this week or the following week, there were only two people in the UK who had the possibility of testing. One was Dr. Tedder, and the other was in the public health laboratory.
Dr. Mortimer?
Philip Mortimer, thank you. I wrote to both of them, or I may have written to one and possibly spoke to Philip at a meeting and said, look, we've got this problem. Can you test the donations? And when I researched it, I think the figure I remember was that there was something like 3,000 donations which had contributed to either the batch, the highly suspect batch, or one of the other batches that we could not exclude as being involved. You see, that's in my 15th of November letter to Dr. Cash, I think, lists the batches. And they both basically said they didn't have the capacity to do that. There was an issue that for the BTS, it would have been actually a very major undertaking, because at that time we had no automated. We had, let me backtrack. We had been storing samples of all donations for several, at least a year or two before this, but we had no automated system for retrieving them, and there was a vast number of donor samples, and it would have been, a major undertaking to get them out. We were prepared to do that, but the problem was that the two laboratories in the UK who might have been able to test declined to do that. They said just didn't have the capacity. In retrospect, I probably should have attempted to find somewhere in the United States that would have tested them. But I didn't. It would have been problematical. I suspect I would not have succeeded, but I regret not at least having made that attempt. So we weren't able to test the original donations. The other question is what, and here I'm in some difficulty because it sort of had proceeded outside my ken. What happened to the batch? Because there were some vials of the batch, whatever number it was, the highly suspect batch. There were a few vials untransfused in the centre in Aberdeen, and I really don't quite. I think this is something that will have to be addressed by someone from the fractionation centre, because I know there was a delay in those samples being tested for the presence of HIV. It was eventually done in the National Institute of Biological Standards, and my recollection of the report was that I think it used worded like something like some sequences that could be HIV, or possibly some HIV sequences were detectable. It was not an unequivocal positive or an unequivocal negative. But as I say, that was out of my responsibility, and my knowledge of that is sort of second or third hand. And that's as much as I can tell you about the subsequent investigation.
Do you know what was done in relation to patients who had received that batch in other centres? Do you know what steps were taken by other centres to contact their patients or arrange for them to be tested? I don't. I have a vague recollection that it is possible that all of the recipients actually were in Edinburgh, were treated in the Edinburgh clinic. That's a vague recollection. I certainly don't have any documentation of that. If there were patients treated with that batch elsewhere, it would be Aberdeen, I think. And
I don't have any knowledge, I don't have any recollection, I should say, of what was done. But in all the documentation about this episode that I have had access to, I don't recall any reference to patients in other centres having received this batch.
Just again, really for the benefit of the transcript, I don't think we need to look at the letters themselves. Your letter to Dr. Tedder asking for if he was able to assist in testing the donation samples is PRSE 40224. His reply is PRSE 40933. And your letter to Dr. Mortimer, you did actually write to Dr. Mortimer, is PRSE 303907. And I should just say that your letter to Dr. Tedder suggested that there were approximately 4,000 donors who had contributed to the batch of Factor VIII in question. Can I then come to the meeting that was held in Edinburgh in the Royal Infirmary on the 19th of December?
Yeah.
Because you attended that meeting. Now, I know, and indeed you made this clear to the Penrose inquiry, you have very little recollection of that meeting, but I do want to ask you a little about it. But before I do that, can I ask you to look at a paragraph in your witness statement, WITN 6666001, and it's page 136. We look at the bottom of the page, you can see you were asked by the inquiry whether you had concerns about the length of time between the discovery that patients had tested positive, and we saw that first phone call from Dr. Ludden to you being the 26th of October, and then the meeting being held on the 19th of December, so nearly 2 months. You say, by way of answer, I cannot say that I remember my feelings at the time. Today, it would be considered very important to ensure transparency by informing patients about their own results with a minimum of delay. So by today's standards, the patients should have been informed of the results of their tests as soon as possible. Now, I'm conscious these were not your patients, Dr. McClelland. It was not your responsibility to inform them. That was the responsibility of their treating clinician. But can I just press you in relation to paragraph 391? Even by the standards of 1984, given what was known about the risk of sexual transmission, and indeed the additional risk in relation to a family where someone has haemophilia of coming into contact with blood, was it not imperative that patients be informed with a minimum of delay of their test results in 1984?
I think the answer has to be yes. I think I stand by what I've said in 391. Lord Penrose pressed me extremely hard on this, and I had to tell him that I was not prepared to try and reinvent my emotions at that particular moment. But well, put it this way, if I had been a patient and something information as grave as that was known about my condition, I would have been very, very disturbed not to know about it. And as you say, the question of the risks of transmitting it to another person would alone, I think, have been a strong reason for providing information as soon as possible.
And then in terms of your own attendance at the meeting, I'm going to ask you to look at what you told the Penrose inquiry, because I think that's probably the quickest way of dealing with it. PRSE 0006040, please, page 99. So you explain at line 8 that you have a recollection of the meeting, but it's more photographs of the venue than any verbal recollection of exactly what took place during or indeed prior to the meeting. If we go to the bottom of the page, you were asked, these are the bottom 2 lines, 3 lines, why you were there, and you say you were there in a very specific capacity as representing the organisation which had manufactured the product which was believed to be the source of the infection, and then you explain a secondary role in being there, which is because of your fairly active involvement in work relating to AIDS more generally. You have, I think, you've got a recollection of Dr. Ludlam speaking. You don't recall Dr. Forbes being there, although you understand he was. And you remember you spoke. But is this right? You don't now have, and indeed I think you didn't when you gave evidence to the Penrose inquiry, any particular recollection of what it was you said?
No, I can imagine pretty much what I would have said, but no, I don't recall that. The whole thing was arranged at extremely short notice for reasons that you were well aware of. I probably was invited by Christopher Ludlam on the day of the meeting, so I hadn't had any time to prepare. I'm not even sure that before I went that I was absolutely clear what the meeting was to be about. But obviously, as soon as I got there, I realised that it was the patients. But as I say, I can imagine what I would have said, which was to explain to them, the precautions that we had been able to take, the fact that we were desperate to have a test, and to express my profound regrets as to what had happened, etc. But I don't recall clearly.
And do you have any recollection or any sense now of what patients were being told at that meeting about their own individual situations?
Yes, I do. I have a recollection which may or may not be accurate. My recollection is that Dr. Ludlam informed the patients that a number of patients had shown evidence of infection with the virus, and that he was inviting all the patients to make an arrangement with him or with his secretary to come and see him individually, so that he could explain the situation to each individual and offer them whatever advice he could, and I guess also put them in touch with support services of some kind.
You referred to.
I'm sure that he did. I'm fairly sure that he did not. No individual patient was told you are HIV positive at the meeting.
You referred a few moments ago to the meeting be arranged at short notice for reasons that are known. For anyone who's listening who hasn't heard earlier evidence about this issue, am I right in understanding you to be referring to the fact that the media had hold of this story and it was going to be published?
Yes.
And that's what prompted the meeting to be held on that particular date, as far as you know?
Yes, absolutely. I've no doubt about that.
Can I then just ask you to look at one news report? It's not the news report that you discuss in your Penrose evidence, I think. It's HSOC 00160029. This is Scotsman, 22nd of December 1984, and I really just want to pick up upon what's attributed to you in this article and just ask if you have any observations on that. So the second paragraph says Dr. Brian McClelland admitted yesterday that it would not have been realistic to expect Scotland to be bypassed. And then there's reference in the next paragraph to self-sufficiency, disappointment for the medical profession. And then if we go to the 5th paragraph, I think, the balance of probability, according to Dr. McClelland, is that the donor of the contaminated blood was a practicing homosexual male, because that's the section of the population considered to be most at risk from the disease. There's a reference to leaflets and so on. And then if we go further down the article, there's a paragraph beginning the Scottish gay community, which refers to what's said to be a degree of unhappiness. And then if we go to the 4th paragraph from the bottom of the page, please, begins, Dr. McClelland prefers to think that the contaminated blood must have been donated unwittingly, but cannot rule out the possibility that the donor deliberately went ahead knowing himself to be a member of the at-risk groups. Transfusion service has no protection against such an action because no practical means has yet been developed for testing individual donors. And then there are 2 passages which are in quotation marks, which so presumably said to be or being reported as directly what you said. If we had to be 100% certain of the purity of all the blood we turn out, we would have to cease operations, but the risk to people from not having blood available would be far greater than the risk of AIDS being transmitted for the foreseeable future. The chances of getting AIDS virus from a transfusion are put at 1 million to 1. Obviously there you're dealing with transfusions as opposed to treatment with factor concentrates.
Absolutely.
Is this, as far as you can recall, an accurate account of what you were saying at the time?
Honestly, can't remember what. I think it's unlikely that I would have used the word purity, but apart from that, I really can't say the exact words I said at the time. I think the sense is broadly correct.
The next topic I want to ask you about, Dr. McClelland, is the process for the introduction of screening for anti-HTLV3, which we know was finally introduced on the 14th of October 1985. First of all, just in general, what was your understanding as at late 1984, the beginning of 1985, of who was going to be taking the decision on whether and how testing would be implemented? Was it for the blood transfusion service? Was it the Department of Health? Was it a Scottish decision, a UK decision? What was your understanding?
Well, my understanding was very clear on one aspect, which was that whatever test method we used, it was going to cost a great deal of money on a long-term recurrent basis, and that we didn't have that money. So we were dependent on ultimately the Treasury, the Department of Health and the Scottish Office and the Scottish Home Health Department clearly would both be dependent on Treasury funding to do it. We also had the complicating factor of the Common Services Agency, although I think on this occasion it was sort of passed straight through them. So it was the bottom line really was that until funding was made available from government sources, we could play around with samples of the tests and so on, but we couldn't start full-scale testing because what was very obvious is once we had started full-scale testing, we couldn't stop. That was a decision for life.
I just want to take you to something you said to the Penrose inquiry on this issue, more generally on this issue of introduction of screening. PRSE 0006050, page 9. If we pick it up, the bottom of the page, from line 18 onwards, you say, I think my own feeling as far as I can recall, and then you say there's not much documentation of this, I think my own feeling was that we needed to get on with it, and even if we had to struggle with a test that was less than perfect, and even if we had to use it selectively initially, we really needed to, top of the next page, move as quickly as possible. And then you were asked, for you as a transfusionist, was it a given that screening would be introduced? And your answer was absolutely. Now, first of all, Dr. McClelland, at the time, so late 1984 through 1985, do you recall having a sense at the time of whether things were being got on with quickly enough, or whether things were taking too long?
I was concerned that they were taking too long, that there was, given reasons being concern about the performance of the available tests, and there was a lot, as I recall, a lot of play was made of the fact that the FDA had not yet, in the States, had not yet licensed any of the tests, and that there was apparently, and I'm not sure whether this is actually true or not, that there was some barrier to importation or for the companies exporting to the UK a test that was not FDA approved. I think the underlying reason might well more have been about the money than about the actual quality of the tests. But that's that's my that's my prejudice.
And looking back at it now, with the breadth of information that's available to you, or the material that you've seen, did the process, the decision-making process, the evaluation process, in your view, take too long?
I think it could have moved a bit quicker. There was one other issue which I should have mentioned in response to your previous question, which was there was a lot of discussion, a lot of play was made about the problem of confirmatory testing, for reasons which are pretty obvious. But I must say, I felt that even if we did not have a satisfactory confirmatory test, and we had to shoulder the problems that would give us, that was not an adequate reason for not commencing testing. So I was a bit impatient, to put it mildly.
And then I just want to ask you to look at one part of your evidence, the Penrose inquiry, and then one contemporaneous document on this issue. And if we go to PRSE 303157, page 13.
Oh, yeah.
So let me just find my marked up copy, if you'll give me a moment, Dr. McClelland. Yes, so if we can just go a little further down the page. You were asked the question, sorry, can we, a little further up, can I have the text of paragraph 17 and then the paragraph that's below? Thank you, perfect. So you were asked the question, why was the evaluation exercise not run in parallel with the introduction of testing? Your answer was, you don't know why the evaluation programme was not run in parallel with the start of routine testing. You then refer to having a recollection about there may have been some limited supplies of test kits in the early months of 1985. If we leave aside the question of availability of test kits, is there is there any reason why the evaluation programme could not have been run in parallel with the start of routine testing in principle?
I probably not. It would have been a very odd, unconventional thing to do. But then this was a very unconventional situation. I mean, I'm not sure whether this appears elsewhere in my Penrose evidence, but it is a matter of fact that that evaluation, for various reasons, did. Let me start again. You will recall the fact that one centre made what was, in my view, a principled decision to start testing with the financial support of the relevant regional health authority quite some months before the so-called official test start date. Following that, a decision was hastily made that two other centres would also join what was rebranded as an evaluation. But in fact, they started testing routinely as well. And in my own centre, and I'm sure this was an agreement reached by the Scottish Regional Transfusion Centres, we had made arrangements with the two suppliers, I think, to get kits to us as early as they possibly could. And actually, we started testing all our donors in July. I think the date was July 1985, considerably before the official starting date. Again, I think we did it under the guise of carrying out an evaluation, but we took the results as real, as live results, and any donations that were discovered positive were excluded from transfusion right from the start of that period. So whether you call it evaluation or whatever, there was quite a bit of routine testing had started way before the official date.
And then the one contemporaneous document I just want to ask you to look at is a letter you wrote to Wellcome on the 8th of January 1985, PRSE 40750. You say in the first paragraph, in the absence of Dr. John Cash, presently on sick leave, I'm writing to you on behalf of the regional transfusion directors in Scotland to ask if you're in a position to give any encouragement about the likely availability of some form of HTLV3 antibody test in the near future. This has been a matter of great concern to us, as to all transfusion people, since the significance of positive antibody testing began to emerge almost a year ago. And you refer in the last sentence of that paragraph to optimism that some form of antibody screening test would be available in the fairly near future. And then in the next paragraph you say, however, I'm not reassured by the information available to me at present. And then, sorry, we don't need that one zoomed in. And then we go to the last paragraph. You sound concerned at the apparent lack of progress. I sincerely hope you can reassure me that Wellcome will shortly be in a position to make some form of antibody detection system available. I feel certain I'm speaking not only for my Scottish colleagues, but for other regional transfusion directors in the UK, if I say that it would be a tremendous step forward if even a limited supply of materials for HTLV3 antibody testing were to be made available in the near future. This would make it possible to begin screening of certainly particularly important groups of donors. Just pausing there, if I may, Dr. McClelland, who were the potential groups of donors that you thought you might be able to start testing with if you had some testing equipment made available to you at that stage?
Well, I possibly sort of rather did it in shorthand for the purposes of this letter, but what I had in mind was specifically using what would be a temporary system, but test units of blood that we would then set aside for babies, children, and perinatal transfusion to mothers before or after childbirth, as being, and working outwards from that group. But it would have had to, we couldn't have done it on the basis of characterizing the donor. We would have had to assign some donations for groups of patients that there would be a reasonable consensus that these should be the first priority to protect.
And then if we go over the page...
That would have been a huge relief to be able to do that.
And then if we go over the page, just the first paragraph, I would emphasise that in my own centre at least, we would be very prepared to use in the interim some form of test procedure which might be considered less than satisfactory for a large-scale, long-term screening programme. I don't think this particular letter to Wellcome actually went anywhere, in the sense you didn't get anything from Wellcome in response.
They were not cooperative, unfortunately. I mean, I had deliberately approached Wellcome because they were the only UK based manufacturer, and there had been such difficulties with the movement of the tests from the United States. They were in very short supply, and I didn't have any optimism at all that I would get a positive approach from any of the US suppliers. I possibly could have tried to go to the Institut Mérieux in France. I'm not sure whether I didn't think about it or I decided it was probably not worth doing.
And then in terms of the actual implementation of testing, you've already told us that you in fact started doing it in July 1985. Can I just ask you to look at PRSC 0004085? So this is a letter from Dr. Cash to Dr. McIntyre at the Scottish Home and Health Department, 28th of October 1985. Dr. Cash says the position in the SNBTS is as follows. All stocks of products held at RTCs were tested prior to the 14th of October 1985 deadline. Now, do you know what the position was in the southeast region in relation to any stocks of products that were not held at the RTC, but which had already been supplied by the RTC to hospitals or hospital blood banks?
Yes, I do. They were all recalled and replaced with test material.
And that, so by the 14th of October 1985, had that been done in your area?
As far as we could assure it, anything that was available to be transfused to any patient had been tested.
I just want to ask you next then, Dr. McClelland, a little bit about your involvement with EAGA, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS. I'm not going to ask you to look at any particular decision or action of EAGA, but just ask you about it a little more generally. Was EAGA, in your view, an effective body, and if so, why?
That's a very hard question for me to give a useful answer to. I did sort of try to go through the minutes of, especially of the earlier meetings, when it did have quite a lot of discussion about transfusion. The later meetings tended to move towards different focuses. I think that the fact that EAGA was bringing together at least some of the many players in the HIV scene, if I can call it that, was helpful. I think there was a valuable exchange of information. I think it certainly helped me to sort of develop my thinking about it by listening to what other people's opinions and experience were. Was it an effective in influencing the actions of government or the actions or directly, as it were, influence the actions of the transfusion service? I'm less sure about that, but I'm sure that people with decision-making responsibility in the Departments of Health did take note of its deliberations. I'd be very surprised if they did not.
And I think I'm right in saying that it was, certainly in the early days, I haven't checked every minute, it was chaired by the Chief Medical Officer. So it had the direct involvement of Donald Aitchison, as well as, I think, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, or one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers.
Certainly, I do remember that for quite a number of meetings, early on, Donald Aitchison chaired it.
Can I just take you to some of the evidence you gave to the Penrose inquiry? You were asked some questions. You may recall, I know you gave evidence on a number of occasions to the Penrose inquiry. You were asked about EGA. You were asked about the ACTTD, to the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases. And you were asked about the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, which you were not a member of.
Correct.
If we just pick it up at PRSE 00006069. Page 11. I'm just going to read some passages from your evidence and then invite you to comment, Dr. McClelland. So if we pick it up at line 14 here and the rest of the page, you say, I think I would say the thing that characterised EGA was that it was actually, and I think remains from fairly recent experience of it, a very well-chaired and disciplined committee that it coped with a very large number, a very diverse range of topics, many of which were highly contentious. My recollection is it coped with them generally in a fairly systematic and transparent sort of way, and tended to produce results in terms of practice recommendations and so on that were well accepted in the professional community. The other important difference, and as I say, you were drawing a distinction between that and the later committees, which is probably reflected in the way the committee actually functioned, was that it was very multidisciplinary, and therefore a problem would be looked at rigorously from probably more different angles than would have been the case in these transfusion virology committees, which actually tended to be quite a sort of, comparatively speaking, a narrow specialist view of things. And then if we can go to page 13, the next page. You were asked about the extent to which the EGA was confidential or secretive, and you answer at paragraph 5, it was certainly less secretive. Line 7, I don't remember ever being instructed or nudged to that there was a confidentiality element to the proceedings of EGA, and then you say that may be a misrecollection. And then if we go over the page 14, line 7, you say you think it was a very pragmatic approach to confidentiality and selective. So, as I understand it, and it's important when we then look at, not necessarily with you, Dr. McClelland, the later minutes and decision-making coming from the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood and its successor. EGA was not, as far as you recall, generally regarded as something where discussions had to be kept confidential. As I understand your evidence at the Penrose inquiry, you were saying there might be elements where there was a confidentiality element to a particular aspect of what was being considered. but your impression was that it was not a secretive or confidential or closed forum. Is that right?
Well, that's my impression. What I can say is I don't think I treated it as confidential, because I think I shared what I'd learned from EGA relevant to transfusion. I think I shared pretty freely with my colleagues. I would have felt it was improper not to. But I mean, there were issues unrelated to transfusion. For example, about how to approach the problem. Surgeons who had HIV infection, stuff like this, which I think may well have the CMO may well have said, please, this until we can decide what to do about this, please keep this discussion confidential. I mean, I'd have to go back to the minutes in detail to validate that.
And then, just while we're on the topic of committees, you were asked in your evidence to the Penrose inquiry, I don't think we need to go to the actual statements or your oral evidence, about the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood and the Advisory Committee in relation to transfusion-transmitted diseases. You were unclear, I think, as to why both those organisations, both those committees, which were looking at similar matters at a similar time, but why both of them were created. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
And did you have, or do you now have, any understanding of why the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood was not established until the end of the 1980s?
I'm not sure that I can say anything terribly helpful about that, but there were, as you will be only too well aware, there were an awful lot of players in the AIDS arena in these early days, and there were, even within the sort of transfusion subsection, there were a lot of players. I think it's probably deep down a certain amount of competition for territory going on, but also a lot of well-intentioned people trying to get their relevant people together to try and do something about it. So it may have taken some time before there was a realization that the whole, as it were, the whole assault on the AIDS problem was very fragmented. I know Professor Cash was very strongly of that view, and I'm sure there's documentation of representations that he made to the Departments of Health to say we need a proper business-like high-level committee to deal with this. I can't really say why it took so long, but that's my general view.
Now, I'm going to move now to ask you about hepatitis. You've told us in your statement that in addition to the knowledge about hepatitis that you acquired generally as a physician and through your own work, you had a personal knowledge of hepatitis because you became seriously ill with hepatitis in 1970. Was that part of what's been referred to elsewhere as the Edinburgh outbreak associated with the renal dialysis unit there?
Yeah, it was the back end of that. I was never counted within the Edinburgh outbreak because I was late. But I think it probably, for lots of reasons about the nature of the illness that I had, I'm sure it was the same bug.
I think, again, you tell us in your statement, you subsequently learned that this was probably non-A, non-B hepatitis that you had.
Yes, there was it was all quite mysterious, actually. There was a very long period elapsed for the professor who had been charged with, as it were, documenting the epidemic. That was Professor Barry Marmion, was then professor of microbiology in Edinburgh. He did eventually publish a paper, but it was quite a long time afterwards. And it doesn't actually shed any light, to me, it doesn't really shed any light on the nature of the infective agent. When later on I got myself tested for hepatitis B antibody, for any residual evidence for hepatitis B, which I didn't have, and later still when the hepatitis C PCR and antibody tests were available, I found those were both negative as well. So it might have been hepatitis C, but I had, some considerable time afterwards, obviously, I had no stigmata of that infection. So I really don't know what I had, but it was very nasty.
Now, in terms of your understanding about post-transfusion hepatitis, by the time you took up your post as director in 1979, would it be right to say that you knew that it was a complication of transfusion, that had been, I think, well documented for a significant period of time, and certainly throughout the 1970s?
Oh, it's been well documented for longer than that, actually. Yes, yeah. Back to Professor Allen in the 60s, I think.
And you, specifically then in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis and its potential seriousness, you told us yesterday that you had some knowledge or awareness of the 1978 research in Sheffield, the Preston research.
Yeah, I do remember learning about that from Professor Cash, who had, as you know, a particular interest in coagulation issues and a particular interest in factor 8 and factor 9. So I certainly learned about that from John Cash, certainly probably before the paper was even written. I was aware of that.
You described in your written and oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry that there was a persisting belief amongst most SNBTS and NBTS transfusion professionals that non-A, non-B hepatitis was a much less common consequence of transfusion than it appeared to be in the USA, and that it was not a particularly serious condition. Can I break that down into, well, first of all, again, if we take matters really from 1979 onwards in terms of your own personal knowledge and understanding, was that your belief as at 1979 and in the early 1980s, that non-A, non-B hepatitis was not a particularly serious condition?
I think it probably was. I mean, I had a copy of Professor Sherlock's book, which will have been quoted by numerous editions of it will have been quoted by others, and I don't. Well, I mean, one specific thing is I don't think that I related the Edinburgh epidemic to non-A, non-B hepatitis particularly. I just knew it was something that wasn't hepatitis B, because that was, and it certainly wasn't hepatitis A. But I had no idea whether it was the same thing that caused raised ALT, raised liver enzyme levels in recipients of blood, which without really quite careful longitudinal study, one could reasonably have passed off as a relatively mild disease, because, as you know, you transfuse somebody and they may be completely asymptomatic for years. If you test their liver enzymes repeatedly, they will be elevated, and then they may come back down to normal, and the next time you test them, they may be elevated or normal. But there is definitely something going on that is not necessarily very easy to detect without a regular program of systematic blood testing, which patients mostly don't have, obviously. So I probably didn't have a sense that this was a hugely sort of lethal disease at that stage when I started.
I may be difficult to say, Dr. McClelland, but do you have any sense of when you think you began to appreciate that it was a much more serious condition?
Well, I can't give you a direct answer to that, but what I can say is that my actions, from quite early on, certainly reflect the fact that I was extremely concerned that we should be doing what we could to find out if any form of testing would actually reduce the incidence of hepatitis, be it mild or serious, in blood recipients. And that's why for over a couple of years, I pursued the project of doing a proper prospective study, which would have given us information actually much earlier than I anticipated, would have given us information that this really was something we had to take seriously. But I should say that it wasn't just the transfusion directors and people that were playing down the disease. The virological experts, most of them were as well, and the sort of most senior virologists on the briefly constituted MRC transfusion committee really poured extremely cold water on the proposal, quoting an earlier study which he said showed that non-A non-B hepatitis wasn't a problem in the UK. For transfusion-related non-A non-B wasn't a problem, and it wasn't worth doing it again. So I was taking it seriously as something that blood could give to donors, could give to recipients, and that we should be taking all action that could to stop that, to detect the risk and stop it at the pass.
And you...
I wasn't successful in that effort, as you know.
Yes, and I want to look at some of the documents in relation to that with you. But you say in your statement to this inquiry, it's just one sentence, I don't think I need to put it up on screen, but it's paragraph 292. You say this: viewed in retrospect, it seems difficult to understand why non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis was believed to be a relatively small problem in the UK. That's your reflection now, at least, yes. Looking back.
I think a lot of it was about the weight of expert opinion and the prevailing belief, and because of those two factors, a reluctance perhaps to take a fresh look at the evidence.
Now, I just want to ask you a little about hepatitis B and hepatitis B testing. What was your understanding at period really 1979 onwards of the nature and effectiveness of the screening tests undertaken on donations of blood for hepatitis B?
79. By 1979, the tests certainly that were in use, I think, across the Scottish service, probably across the English service, but certainly we were using a radioimmunoassay test, which was initially, I should say, based on the Abbott test, but for reasons of economy, it was a modified version of the Abbott test, which attracted considerable criticism, and eventually we reverted to using the test as it described on the tin, as it were. But the test was very effective. There was a weak area, I have to say, in the testing procedure that I inherited, which was that while the actual analytical process itself was very sensitive, the data management that emerged, of the results was far from satisfactory, and it was actually extremely easy for a member of staff to miss a positive result on the printout from the machine, and that I identified very, very early on as a major risk, and we actually purchased and installed the very first bit of computing equipment in the Edinburgh Centre to deal with just that problem.
You wrote a paper in 1979. I'm not going to go through it, but it's for the transcript. It's CBLA 001043, which was looking at the advantages and disadvantages, I think, of the different types of tests and their relative sensitivities. As I say, I'm not going to take you to that, but I do want to then just ask you about a letter written by you in 1986. It's SBTS 40352_076. This is you to Dr. Cuthbertson at the PFC in May 1986, headed HBsAg sensitivity. If we pick it up in the third line of the letter, the somewhat lower sensitivity of the BPL assay as used in the Edinburgh Centre is not particularly surprising, since we use a non-standard version of the BPL kit. We were well aware of the superior performance of the Wellcome assay, hence my enthusiasm for making the change to this technology as soon as possible. What was the concern here, or the issue here, about in relative terms at least, the lower sensitivity of the assay in use at the Edinburgh Centre as at 1986?
I honestly can't remember, and I have to confess that I missed this letter in reading the documents. So it's the first time I've seen it, probably since I wrote it. I know that the BPL assay, and I had forgotten that we were using a modified version of that. I don't know why we were. Possibly the equipment. Oh, I know why. Because the equipment that we had could only read the results using these little beads. We didn't have equipment for reading or processing the microplates correctly. I really don't remember how what the difference in sensitivity of these two tests was, but clearly I was unhappy with the performance of the test we were using, and as I've stated here, I was keen to change to an assay provided by Wellcome at that time. We went through quite a lot of different assay providers over this early period before, I think, eventually settling on the system provided by Abbott Laboratories, who I think now dominate the scene.
And then if we can just look at MACK 000133. Now, this is a study concerned, I think, with the period up to 1979. And it's a 1983 publication. Incidence of infection with hepatitis B virus in 56 patients with haemophilia A, 71 to 79. If we go over the page, I think we only need to read the summary. During each of the 4-year periods, 71 to 75 and 75 to 79, so it's the summary towards the top of the page, thank you. The annual incidence of hepatitis B infections been assessed in 56 patients with haemophilia A, by measuring plasma HBsAg, anti-HBs and anti-HBC levels. Infection rates of 7% and 9.5% per annum respectively were observed for each 4-year period. despite the screening of individual blood donations for HBsAg. Highest incidence of seroconversion was amongst severe haemophiliacs. And then, last sentence, we conclude that haemophiliacs are still at high risk of infection by hepatitis B virus, despite the screening of individual blood donors for HBsAg. Were you aware of this research being undertaken, Dr. McClelland?
Well, yes, I do indeed remember Louise Sterling doing this work, yes.
Now, that says in terms that hepatitis B is still being transmitted in this period of time, up to 1979, notwithstanding screening. Do you accept that, or does it surprise you?
That's what she found, you know. I was aware of this at the time. I did glance at this paper recently, but I can't remember whether she did she look at this, at the treatment that these patients had received. Were some of them getting commercial products as well? I can't remember. I mean, what surprised me looking at this data again was that 1971-75, we were probably still on the tail end. Yes, in fact, we definitely were still using a much less sensitive assay, as a hemagglutination type assay. 75 to 79, I would have expected that we were into radioimmunoassay by then. Possibly not. Or part of that period may still have been the product that they received might well have been still tested with the less sensitive assays, bearing in mind the delay between donation and the actual blood reaching the plasma reaching final product. You know, it might be a couple of years between the final product and the donation. I couldn't really comment on those results without more information, but the rate, the fact that there's a significant rate of infection in haemophilia patients during this period is not hugely surprising, because the early assays were known to be substantially less sensitive. That's as much as I can say with the information on the screen.
And then if we go to SBTS 40377_062. Yes, let me check I've got it right. SBTS 40377_062. This is a memo from you to Dr. Gillen, March 1991. It's in the context of a medico-legal report that had been produced. I really only want to ask you about the third paragraph and the more general point that's made there. You say, we will have to anticipate that the outcome of this case may lead to considerable pressure to move for the introduction of anti-core testing. Although I don't have specific information, I'm certain that the other cases on the go elsewhere in the UK. You did not quote the sentence from the transfusion editorial, which reads, recent studies of post-transfusion hepatitis B support the continued use of anti-HBC testing of donor blood as a means of eliminating the rare cases of post-transfusion hepatitis B which continue to occur despite HBsAg screening. Now, I'm not asking you here about the issue of whether anti-HBC screening should have been introduced in the 1990s, Dr. McClelland. It's the more general point. Is it right to understand that, certainly as at 1991, it was recognised that cases of post-transfusion hepatitis B could still occur, albeit described there rarely, you had far more sensitive testing by this time than you'd had in the 1970s, but nonetheless, some cases of post-transfusion hepatitis B were still identified. Is that broadly correct?
I think it is correct, yes.
I don't quite understand what's being said there, because the bit in quotes says that it supports the continued use of anti-HBC testing as a means of eliminating the rare cases of post-transfusion hepatitis B which continue to occur. So it seems to be saying there is a testing system which is effective, but cases occur. Does it mean cases would otherwise occur if it hadn't been for the anti-HBC testing? What does it mean?
I think the most likely possibility is that I have misquoted the quote, actually, because core testing has, to my knowledge, never been used routinely. It's been a subject of immense debate among the virologists, specialist transfusion virologists, for years, but I don't think it has ever been used as a routine test. So either what the transfusion editorial I quoting has a mistake in it, or I made a mistake in quoting it, which is entirely possible. Yes, I don't actually know if there's a reference to the actual document here, so I couldn't assist with going back to the original text.
There isn't, I'm afraid.
In any event, we can be clear that there wasn't anti-HBC testing. This is suggesting it should happen.
What I'm addressing with Dr. Gillen here is that this particular case is likely to raise again pressure to introduce anti-core testing.
Yes,
and this was something that this was something of a recurring theme. As far as I can recall, having looked briefly at the current guidelines, they do recommend or require a very selective use of anti-core testing, but not routine.
You?
Dr. McClelland, then the final topic before lunch, and it's a one-question topic, but so I hope, sir, you'll indulge me in asking it, notwithstanding that we've reached 1 o'clock. Is this: what was, in broad terms, in general terms, the system at in the southeast region for the reporting and investigation of cases of possible transfusion hepatitis?
You're referring to cases that were reported after a patient had discharged from hospital, that were thought possibly to be caused by transfusion. I just want to be sure I'm answering.
So if it was drawn to your attention or the transfusion centre's attention that there was a possible incident of post-transfusion hepatitis, what was the system for dealing with that?
Yes, I've tried. I did watch Professor Hewitt's evidence in this, and I've tried quite hard to reconstruct some sort of recollection myself. The honest answer is I actually don't remember. I think it was quite a rare occurrence. And it is quite possible that some of the cases that were reported didn't reach my desk because they would have been dealt with probably by the donor consultant. The procedures required, which I think you've already heard from other witnesses, would have involved essentially a look back, look forward exercise, and saying what blood did this patient get blood. Not always very easy to achieve. If they did, can the transfusing hospital give us the correct donation numbers? They couldn't always. given those donation numbers, we would then examine all the donors' records and see if there was any donor who appeared to have any evidence that they might have transmitted infection. If there was, then we would proceed with the sort of standard look-back procedure. However, the weak point in this whole system undoubtedly, well, first of all, was the recognition of post-transfusion hepatitis, because many cases will undoubtedly have been pretty much asymptomatic with nothing more to detect than a transient raise in ALT results. So, you know, there is no question that in many cases where post-transfusion hepatitis had occurred, which if it was hepatitis C, could progress to serious disease considerably later on, but would simply not be recognized in its early stages.
Thank you. So probably the right time to take lunch, because I'm going to move on to the topic of surrogate testing, which is a much bigger topic to explore.
Yes, very well. We'll come back at 1:55 in that case. 1:55, if you please.